Commander Vextal shifted in his chair at the front of the lecture hall. His alien body was covered in thick armor-like skin, and 4 yellow eyes looked out at the young soldiers sitting before him. Old battle scars marked his face and arms, telling stories of fights across the galaxy that had lasted for decades. The room was packed with junior officers, all eager to hear from the famous commander. They whispered among themselves, excited to learn from someone who had seen so much combat. Vextal was a legend. Everyone knew his name and the battles he had won. "So you want to know about humans," he said, his voice deep and rough like gravel. "You want to understand why these newcomers were given a seat at our Federation table so fast, when other species wait centuries for such honor." He paused, letting his words sink in. The room went completely quiet. Even the air recycling system seemed to hush as everyone leaned forward to listen. "I see the confusion in your faces," Vextal continued. "You're thinking the same thing our High Command thought 3 years ago. How could one small species, trapped in a single star system for thousands of years, possibly earn respect from an alliance that spans half the galaxy?" A young female officer near the front raised her hand. Her skin was pale blue, marking her as one of the Zentari people. "Commander, sir, our ships are bigger, our weapons more advanced. Surely their primitive technology was no match for our fleets." Vextal's mouth parts clicked together, a sound that other species had learned meant amusement, though it often sounded threatening to newcomers. "Ah, technology. That's exactly what Admiral Korith said when he led our armada to the Sol system. Primitive humans with their chemical rockets and nuclear weapons. We'll have them surrendering before lunch." The commander stood up slowly, his large frame casting shadows across the front rows. That was the first mistake. The second mistake was thinking that newer always means better. The third mistake was believing that humans fight the way civilized species fight. He walked to the large display screen behind him and touched a control panel. The screen lit up, showing a star map with Earth's solar system highlighted in the center. "Let me tell you about Captain Jiho Kim," Vextal said, his voice growing more serious. "This human commanded a destroyer that was over 50 years old. By our standards, it should have been scrapped decades ago. The hull was patched with welds, the engines were held together with spare parts, and the weapon systems were so outdated they didn't even appear in our threat assessment databases." The young officers looked at each other with growing curiosity. Where was this story going? When our advanced scouts first detected Kim's ship limping through the asteroid belt, they laughed. One small broken vessel against the might of the hegemony war machine. Our tactical computers didn't even classify it as a threat, just marked it as debris to be cleared. Vextal's 4 eyes gleamed as he remembered that day. But Captain Kim had something our computers couldn't calculate, something our advanced algorithms couldn't predict. He had spent 30 years fighting pirates, smugglers, and raiders in those same asteroid fields. He knew every rock, every hiding spot, every gravitational current that could be used as a weapon. The room was completely silent now. Even the usual shuffling of feet and rustling of uniforms had stopped. What happened next changed everything we thought we knew about warfare, the commander continued. It wasn't about who had the bigger guns or the faster ships. It was about who understood that every piece of space debris could become a missile, every asteroid could become a shield, and every enemy weakness could be turned into a deadly trap. He looked directly at the young Zentari officer who had asked about technology. "You see, child, we had fallen into the trap that destroys many advanced civilizations. We had become so focused on building perfect weapons that we forgot the most important weapon of all, the mind that wields them." The story was just beginning, and already the young officers were hanging on every word, realizing they were about to learn something that would change how they thought about combat forever. Vextal. Touch the control panel again, and the holographic display came to life above their heads. The 3-dimensional image showed Earth's solar system in perfect detail, the sun at the center, planets orbiting in their ancient dance, and asteroids scattered throughout the vast darkness. It was the year 2387, according to human timekeeping, the commander said, his voice settling into the rhythm of an old storyteller. Our intelligence reports painted a simple picture. One species confined to a single star system for over 1,000 years. No faster than light travel, no energy shields, no quantum weapons. They were like children playing with sticks, while we carried plasma cannons. The display zoomed in to show hundreds of sleek alien warships approaching the edge of the solar system. Each vessel was massive, bristling with weapons that could crack planets in half. The formation moved with perfect precision, like a deadly ballet performed in the void of space. Admiral Korith commanded our advance fleet, Vextal continued. 300 ships, each one capable of destroying entire cities with a single shot. We had conquered 47 different species using this exact same approach. Roll up to their homeworld, demand surrender, and watch them fold like paper. A young officer in the back row raised his hand. What was the standard protocol, sir? Simple and effective, Vextal replied. We would position our ships in orbit around their planet, power up our main weapons so they could see we meant business, then broadcast a message on all frequencies, the same message we had used dozens of times before. The hologram showed the alien fleet taking position around Earth, their weapons charging with deadly energy. The message was always the same, the commander said. Surrender within 30 minutes, or watch your cities burn from orbit. Most species would start broadcasting their surrender before we even finished talking. The smart ones would have already prepared their submission documents. The room buzzed with quiet conversation as the young officers imagined how terrifying it must have been for those conquered worlds. But Earth was different, Vextal said, and the room went quiet again. Admiral Korith sent the message and settled back to wait for the inevitable surrender broadcast. He even started preparing the occupation paperwork. That's how routine this had become for us. The display shifted to show a single small human ship emerging from behind Earth's moon. Compared to the massive alien vessels, it looked like a minnow swimming among sharks. Then Captain Ji-Ho Kim responded, Vextal said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. His ship, the UES Defiant, was older than some of our junior officers. Patches covered the hull where meteor impacts had been repaired. The weapons were so outdated, they used chemical explosives instead of energy beams. The young officers leaned forward, fascinated despite themselves. We expected him to beg for mercy, or maybe try to negotiate for better surrender terms. The commander continued. Instead, Kim opened a communication channel to our entire fleet. His message was broadcast on every frequency, heard by every ship, recorded by every computer. Vextal paused, letting the tension build in the room like pressure in a sealed container. 7 words, he said finally. Just 7 simple words that changed the course of galactic history forever. The hologram zoomed in on the human destroyer, showing its battle-scarred hull and jury-rigged weapons. Captain Kim looked directly into his communication screen, stared at an alien fleet that outgunned him 1,000 to 1 and said, Admiral, you picked the wrong species today. Several officers gasped. The audacity was breathtaking. What happened? Next, Vextal said as the holographic display erupted into simulated combat, taught us that there's a difference between fighting a war and engineering a victory. Humans, we discovered, don't just react to battles, they design them from the ground up, turning every disadvantage into a weapon and every weakness into a trap. The room watched in stunned silence as the simulation showed the beginning of humanity's impossible stand against overwhelming odds. The holographic display shifted again, this time showing a dense field of spinning rocks and metal debris floating in the darkness of space. Vextal gestured toward the chaotic scene with one of his forearms. After Captain Kim's bold declaration, our fleet expected a straightforward battle, he said, his voice carrying a note of grim respect. We had our ships arranged in the classic diamond formation, a battle pattern that had served us well for over 1,000 years. Every vessel knew its position, every commander understood their role. The young officers nodded. They had all studied the diamond formation in their tactical classes. It was considered nearly unbeatable when executed properly. But then Commander Minji Park arrived with her squadron, Vextal continued. 12 human ships against our forward battle group of 120 vessels. The numbers were so lopsided that Admiral Korith almost felt sorry for them. The hologram zoomed in to show the human ships, each one smaller than even the escort vessels in the alien fleet. They looked like toys compared to the massive hegemony warships. Park's ships didn't form up in any pattern we recognized, the commander explained. "Instead of trying to match our formation, they scattered like leaves in the wind. Our tactical computers couldn't even predict their movements because there didn't seem to be any logic to them." A young officer near the middle of the room raised her hand. "Sir, that sounds like suicide. How can scattered ships hope to coordinate their attacks?" Vextel's mouthparts clicked in what might have been admiration. "That's exactly what we thought. Our weapons officers were already calculating firing solutions, expecting to pick off the human ships one by one like shooting practice targets." The eye display showed the alien ships beginning their attack, massive energy beams lancing out toward the scattered human vessels. "But Commander Park had studied our weapons," Vextal said, his voice growing more intense. "She knew that our plasma cannons were incredibly powerful, but they took several seconds to charge between shots. She also knew something about the asteroid belt that we had overlooked. The hologram focused on the space around them, showing thousands of rocks floating in complex orbital patterns. Every time we fired our main guns at her ships, Park would position her vessels so that our missed shots would hit the asteroids behind them," the commander explained. "At first we thought she was just lucky. Our beams would blast apart rocks, creating clouds of debris, but we figured that was just collateral damage." The young officers watched as the simulation showed more and more asteroids being destroyed, creating an ever-growing field of spinning rocks and metal fragments. "Within 30 minutes, something impossible started happening," Vextal continued. "The debris from our own weapons was beginning to form patterns. Park wasn't just dodging our shots, she was using them to reshape the entire battlefield." The display showed human ships weaving between the floating rocks with impossible precision, while the larger alien vessels struggled to navigate the increasingly cluttered space. "Our sensors started having trouble," the commander admitted. "All that spinning metal and rock was interfering with our targeting systems. But somehow the human ships seemed to know exactly where every piece of debris was located." A junior officer in the front row looked confused. How could they track all that chaos without advanced computer systems? "That's what our tactical officers wanted to know," Vextal replied. "We assumed they must have some kind of quantum-level coordination technology that our intelligence had missed. How else could 12 separate ships move through that maze like they were connected by invisible strings?" The hologram showed the human squadron suddenly converging from multiple directions, appearing out of the debris field like ghosts materializing from thin air. "But the most disturbing part wasn't their coordination," the commander said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "The most disturbing part was watching our own ships, vessels that had conquered dozens of worlds, getting confused and colliding with rocks that they should have easily avoided." The simulation showed several hegemony ships crashing into asteroids, their perfect formations broken apart by the chaos that Commander Park had created using nothing but their own weapons. In less than an hour, she had turned our greatest strength against us, Vextal concluded. Our powerful guns became tools for building her fortress. Our superior numbers became a disadvantage in the tight spaces she had created. And our perfect formation became a liability when the battlefield itself was constantly changing. The room sat in stunned silence as they realized the implications of what they were hearing. The holographic display changed once more, now showing Earth surrounded by a tight ring of alien warships. Red lines indicated blocked supply routes, while flashing symbols marked captured mining stations and trade posts. It looked like a perfect siege. Nothing could get in or out of the human home system. After Commander Park's tactics showed us that humans could think differently about combat, Admiral Korith decided on a more traditional approach, Vextal said, pointing to the siege formation. "If we couldn't defeat them quickly in battle, we would starve them into submission." The display showed charts and graphs, food supplies, ammunition counts, fuel reserves, all trending steadily downward toward zero. Our war computers calculated everything perfectly, the commander continued. Earth had enough stored food for maybe 2 months of normal consumption. Their ammunition factories could only produce so many rounds per day. Their fuel refineries had limited capacity. Basic mathematics said they would be forced to surrender within 6 weeks. A young officer near the back looked puzzled. "That seems reasonable, sir. How could any species fight without supplies?" Vextal's expression grew darker, more troubled. That's what every civilized military leader would assume. Cut off the supply lines, wait for them to run out of bullets and food, then accept their surrender. Clean, efficient, predictable. The hologram zoomed in on Earth's orbital defense stations, showing human ships patrolling in careful patterns around their homeworld. Colonel Donghyun Lee commanded the orbital defense grid, Vextal explained. Our intelligence profiles said he was a competent but unremarkable officer. Good grades at their military academy, solid combat record, nothing that suggested exceptional abilities. The display showed human supply convoys growing smaller and less frequent as the siege tightened. Week 3 came and went. Week 4. Week 5, the commander counted off on his fingers. Our psychological warfare specialists prepared surrender, acceptance protocols. We even started discussing which human leaders we would negotiate with, but the hologram showed something unexpected. Human ships still patrolling, still fighting, still defending their world, even as their supplies dwindled to almost nothing. Week 6 arrived and nothing happened, Vextal said, his voice filled with remembered confusion. No surrender broadcasts, no white flags, no desperate attempts to break through our blockade. Colonel Lee's ships just kept flying their patrol routes like nothing had changed. The young officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't following any military logic they had been taught. Week 8, Week 10, Week 12, the commander continued. Our own supply officers started getting nervous. They had calculated enough provisions for a 6-week siege, not a 3-month standoff. The display showed human ships that looked increasingly battered and patched together, but still maintaining their defensive positions. That's when we started noticing the details that our computers had missed, Vextal said. Lee's people weren't just running out of ammunition. They were making new ammunition from mining equipment. They weren't just running low on food. They were eating survival rations that would poison most species in the galaxy. A Zentari officer raised her hand. Sir, how is that possible? Those emergency rations are designed for short-term survival. Only. Exactly what our medical experts said, Vextal replied. But humans, we discovered, have stomachs that can digest almost anything. They were living on concentrated protein bars that would cause organ failure in my species within days. The hologram showed human ships with solar panels attached to their hulls, clearly improvised modifications. Their weapons were supposed to run out of power, so they attached research station solar collectors to their warships, the commander explained. Their railguns were supposed to run out of proper ammunition, so they started firing chunks of processed metal ore that worked almost as well. The room was completely silent now, everyone trying to process what they were hearing. Month 7 of the siege, we finally captured one of their supply depots, Vextal said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Colonel Soyoung Choi had been managing their ammunition reserves. When our forces broke into her facility, they found something that changed everything. The display showed detailed inventory sheets and supply charts. She had been rationing their ammunition not for months but for years, the commander revealed. Every bullet, every missile, every energy cell had been carefully calculated to last for decades of continuous warfare. They weren't planning to surrender when their supplies ran low. They were planning to fight us until their son died of old age. The implications hit the room like a physical blow. Several officers actually leaned back in their chairs. We realized then that we weren't fighting a desperate last stand, Vextal concluded. We were fighting a species that had looked at an impossible situation and decided to make it possible through sheer stubborn refusal to give up. The holographic display transformed to show the rings of Saturn, with dozens of industrial platforms and mining stations scattered throughout the ice and rock debris. Titan Station, humanity's largest fuel processing facility, sat like a glowing jewel among the swirling particles. By month 8 of the siege, we thought we understood human tactics, Vextal said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. Individual commanders like Park and Lee had shown us they could be creative and stubborn, but they were still fighting as separate units, each doing their own thing. The display zoomed in to show a fleet of human ships, 12 sleek cruisers. That looked tiny, compared to the massive alien battle group approaching them. Captain Hyunwoo Nam was different, the commander continued. Our intelligence files said he was young for a fleet commander, only 32 years old by their counting. He had spent most of his career fighting space pirates in the outer system. Nothing that should have prepared him for major fleet combat. A young officer in the third row looked skeptical. 12 ships against 47, sir? That's not just difficult odds, that's suicide. Vextal's mandibles clicked, but this time the sound seemed almost sad. That's what Admiral Korith thought too. He assigned his second-best battle group to capture Titan Station, expecting to overwhelm Nam's small force within minutes. The hologram showed the alien ships moving into their familiar diamond formation, weapons charging, preparing for what should have been a quick and easy victory. But something strange happened as soon as the battle began, Vextal said, manipulating the display to show the opening moments of combat. Nam's ships didn't scatter like Park had done. They didn't form defensive positions like Lee would have. Instead, they started moving like— He paused, searching for the right words. Like they were all controlled by a single mind, he finally said, but we knew that was impossible. Our sensors showed no quantum communication links, no neural network connections, no computer coordination systems. Yet somehow these 12 separate ships began moving as one creature. The simulation showed human vessels weaving between the larger alien ships in patterns that seemed almost choreographed. They moved with a precision that made the watching officers gasp. Lieutenant Yuna Ko commanded the escort wing, 4 of the smallest human ships in the formation, Vextal continued. When our main battle line opened fire, she didn't try to save her ships or retreat to safety. The display focused on Ko's vessels as they suddenly accelerated directly toward the alien fleet's heaviest weapons. Instead, she led her entire wing straight into our firing pattern, the commander explained. At first, we thought it was panic. New commanders sometimes make desperate moves when they're overwhelmed. The young officers watched as the human escort ships took devastating hits, their hulls cracking under the alien weapons fire. But Ko wasn't panicking, Vextal said, his voice filled with grudging respect. She was sacrificing herself and her crews to create an opening for Captain Nam's flagship. Every shot we fired at her ships was a shot we couldn't fire at his main attack. The hologram showed Nam's cruiser sliding through the gap created by Ko's sacrifice, positioning itself perfectly behind the alien formation's shield generators. Then Commander Taehyung Seo did something even more shocking, Vextal continued. His ship had taken heavy damage, engines failing, weapons offline, life support barely functioning. Any reasonable commander would have withdrawn to make repairs. But the display showed Seo's damaged cruiser suddenly changing course, accelerating, directly toward the alien flagship. We thought he had lost control of his ship, the commander admitted. Our damage control teams even prepared to rescue survivors from what we assumed would be an accidental collision. The room held its breath as they watched the simulation. But Seo wasn't out of control, Vextal revealed. He had calculated the exact angle and speed needed to ram our shield generators without destroying his own ship completely. It was precision, flying that our best pilots couldn't have matched, performed by a man whose ship was literally falling apart around him. The hologram showed the alien flagship's shields flickering and failing, just as Nam's cruiser opened fire at point-blank range. In 12 minutes, they had destroyed a battle group that should have outgunned them 4-1, Vextal said quietly. But that wasn't the terrifying part. The terrifying part was realizing that Ko and Seo hadn't made desperate mistakes. They had made calculated sacrifices. The commander looked directly at his audience, his 4 eyes reflecting the holographic light. We started calling it the Wolfpack Doctrine after studying recordings of Earth's predators, he explained. Individual wolves will sacrifice themselves to position the pack for a killing strike. Each member knows their role, and each member will die to ensure the pack survives and succeeds. The implications were staggering, and it showed on every face in the room. We weren't just fighting 12 ships, Vextal concluded. We were fighting one organism with 12 bodies, each willing to die so the others could live. I'll expand this section for you right away, focusing on making it engaging and human-centered with simple language. The holographic display changed to show documents floating in the air, pages covered with text in dozens of different human languages. English, Korean, Spanish, Arabic, Chinese, all the major languages of Earth represented in what looked like legal documents. While our fleets were battling human forces in space, our intelligence division was working hard to understand how these people thought, Vextal said, his voice becoming more thoughtful. We had captured several human data storage devices during raids on their outer settlements. He gestured toward the floating documents with one of his 4 arms. Most of what we found was exactly what you'd expect. Tactical manuals, supply lists, communication protocols, standard military information that helped us understand their capabilities. A young officer near the front leaned forward with interest. "What made this document different, sir?" "At first, nothing," Vextal admitted. "It looked like more military paperwork, but our translation computers kept flagging it as important, even though our analysts couldn't understand why." The hologram zoomed in on specific sections of text, highlighting phrases about prisoner treatment and civilian protection. "The document was called the Geneva Conventions," the commander continued. "It contained hundreds of rules about how wars should be fought. Rules about not targeting hospitals, about treating captured enemies with respect, about protecting people who weren't soldiers." Several officers exchanged confused glances. This didn't sound like military doctrine they recognized. "Our first reaction was laughter," Vextal said, his mandibles clicking in remembered amusement. "We thought it had to be some kind of joke or propaganda piece. What kind of species writes rules that make war harder for themselves?" The display showed charts comparing human weapons to what the Geneva Conventions allowed and prohibited. "General, Sunho Park was our expert on alien psychology," the commander explained. "The High Command assigned him to figure out whether these Geneva Conventions represented some kind of human weakness we could exploit." The room grew quieter as the officers sensed something darker was coming. "Park spent 3 weeks studying every piece of human military history we had captured," Vextal continued. "Battle records, weapon specifications, tactical innovations. What he discovered in his final report changed everything we thought we knew about our enemy." The holographic display shifted to show weapon designs and battle tactics that made several young officers gasp in shock. "The Geneva Conventions weren't propaganda," the commander said, his voice dropping lower. "They were restrictions that humans had placed on themselves, rules they had created to limit their own destructive capabilities." A Zentari officer in the CCG, the middle row, raised her hand. "So why would any species deliberately limit their military effectiveness?" Vextal's expression grew troubled, almost haunted. That's exactly what Captain Yunji Han asked when she read Park's report. Her analysis team had been studying human weapons technology, trying to understand why their equipment seemed so crude compared to ours. The display showed side-by-side comparisons of human and alien weapons systems. Han discovered that the weapons humans were using against us, plasma rifles, antimatter torpedoes, directed energy cannons, these were all classified as conventional. "Weapons by their own standards," Vextal explained. The implications began to sink in and uncomfortable murmurs spread through the room. Buried deep in their military archives, Han found references to weapons that were banned by the Geneva Conventions, the commander continued. Biological agents that could wipe out entire planets, chemical compounds that could poison solar systems, something they called planet crackers that could literally split worlds in half. The young officers sat in stunned silence as they processed this information. We realized that every battle we had fought, every clever tactic we had faced, every desperate stand they had made, all of it had been accomplished while they were deliberately holding back, Vextal said. The humans weren't using their full military capability against us. They were following rules they had created to keep warfare from becoming too terrible. He paused, letting the weight of that revelation settle on his audience. Captain Han's final report contained one sentence that kept our entire command staff awake for days, the commander concluded. She wrote, "We are not fighting humanity at war. We are fighting humanity at peace, trying to remain civilized while defending their home." The room fell completely silent as everyone contemplated the terrifying question that naturally followed. What would happen if humans decided to stop being civilized? The atmosphere in the lecture hall grew heavy as Vextal's expression darkened. The holographic display shifted to show a peaceful human colony, New Geneva, with its sprawling cities, agricultural domes, and orbital platforms where millions of people lived and worked. By the 10th month of the siege, Admiral Korith was growing frustrated, Vextal said, his voice taking on a grim tone. The humans had survived everything we threw at them. Our blockade should have starved them into submission. Our superior firepower should have broken their will to fight. The display zoomed in on the colony, showing families going about their daily lives, children playing in parks, people working in the agricultural sections, students attending classes in the orbital universities. New Geneva was one of humanity's outer colonies, the commander continued. 15 million civilians lived there. Farmers, teachers, engineers, artists, people who had nothing to do with the war except being human. Several young officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing where this story was heading. Admiral Korith called it a demonstration of resolve, Vextal said, his mandibles clicking in what sounded like disgust. He believed that if we showed the humans what happens to those who resist the hegemony, Earth would finally surrender to save their remaining colonies. The holographic display showed the approach of hegemony warships, their weapons charging for orbital bombardment. The attack lasted 6 hours, the commander said quietly. Our ships systematically destroyed every city, every farm, every orbital platform. 15 million people died in a single day. The room fell silent, except for the hum of the air recycling systems. Even the most hardened young officers looked disturbed by the scale of destruction. We expected immediate surrender broadcasts. From Earth, Vextal continued, instead something unprecedented happened. Colonel Minho Kang was monitoring all human communication frequencies, waiting for their surrender message. The display showed communication monitoring stations with their screens and speakers completely quiet. But no surrender came, the commander said. In fact, no communications came at all. Every military frequency went dead. Every civilian broadcast stopped. Even their entertainment networks shut down. A young officer near the back raised his hand nervously. Sir, maybe their communication systems were damaged? Vextal shook his head slowly. That's what we thought at first. But our sensors showed. Their equipment was still working perfectly. The silence wasn't technical, it was deliberate. The hologram showed Earth and its remaining colonies all completely quiet on every communication channel. For exactly 72 hours, the entire human species went silent, the commander explained. No military orders, no civilian chatter, no emergency broadcasts. It was as if they had all decided to stop talking at exactly the same moment. The eerie implications of this coordinated silence began to sink in among the listening officers. Colonel Kang reported that the silence felt wrong somehow, Vextal continued. Like the calm before a terrible storm, our psychological warfare experts said it reminded them of how predators go quiet just before they attack. The display began showing human fleet movements resuming after the 3-day silence, but something was visibly different about their formations and tactics. When human communications resumed, we immediately knew something had changed, the commander said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. Commander Haeun Yu's strike force was the first to engage our ships after the silence ended. The Gi hologram showed a human attack that looked nothing like their previous battles. Instead of the clever tactics and resourceful improvisation they had shown before, this was something far more systematic and terrifying. Yu's ships used weapons we had never seen before, Vextal explained. Microscopic machines that could disassemble our ship hulls atom by atom, turning our own vessels into raw materials for their war effort. The simulation showed hegemony ships literally dissolving as clouds of tiny machines consumed their metal hulls and internal systems. Major Ji-won Lee introduced psychological tactics that went far beyond normal warfare, the commander continued. She would broadcast the final communications from New Geneva Colony on all frequencies while her ships attacked, the voices of children calling for their parents, the last words of people who knew they were about to die. Several officers in the room visibly flinched at the description, but the most disturbing part wasn't the new weapons or the psychological attacks, Vextal said, his 4 eyes reflecting the holographic light. The most disturbing part was the realization that the Geneva Conventions hadn't been their weakness after all. They had been humanity's conscience, their way of staying civilized even during war. The commander's voice became barely audible as he delivered his final point. We had killed 15 million innocent people, and in doing so we had killed the part of humanity that believed in showing mercy to their enemies. I'll expand this section for you right away, with engaging storytelling and simple language. The holographic display flickered and changed to show something that looked like a massive library. Thousands of data files, historical records, and military documents floating in organized patterns through the air. Vextel's expression grew more troubled as he gestured toward the overwhelming collection of information. While our fleets were learning to fear human tactics in space, Captain Chanwoo Park's intelligence team was making a discovery that would change everything we thought we knew about warfare itself, Vextel said, his voice so quiet that officers in the back rows had to lean forward to hear him. The display zoomed in on specific files, showing dates that stretched back thousands of Earth years. Park's team had been tasked with a simple job: analyze captured human computer systems to find weaknesses in their military structure. The commander continued. What they found instead was a complete record of human military history, going back over 5,000 years. A young officer raised her hand tentatively. Sir, most species don't keep detailed war records for that long. What made human archives so extensive? Vextel's mandibles clicked, but this time the sound was filled with something that might have been fear. That's exactly what puzzled our analysts at first. Most civilized species fight wars occasionally, maybe once every few centuries, when resources become scarce or territorial disputes arise. The hologram began showing a timeline that stretched across the display, marked with thousands of red dots representing conflicts. But humans, the commander said, his voice growing more strained, humans had been fighting almost continuously for their entire recorded history, not just small skirmishes or border disputes, full-scale wars involving millions of their own people. The officers in the room exchanged worried glances as the implications began to sink in. Major Seoyeon Kim was assigned to analyze their weapons development, Vextel continued. She expected to find the typical progression most species follow: simple projectile weapons evolving slowly into basic energy systems over thousands of years. The display showed weapon designs that made several young officers gasp and lean back in their chairs. Instead, Kim discovered that humans had developed and deployed weapons of incredible sophistication while fighting each other, the commander explained. The antimatter torpedoes they used against our ships. They had been using similar weapons in their own civil wars for over 2 centuries. The hologram focused on weapon specifications that seemed impossible for a single system species to have. Developed the directed energy cannons that could punch through our armor. Humans had been refining that technology through decades of conflicts with each other, Vextel said. Every weapon system we faced had been tested and improved through actual combat experience against equally advanced opponents. A tremor of fear ran through the room as officers realized what this meant. But Colonel Jae-hyun Ro's discoveries were even more disturbing, the commander continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Buried deep in human military archives, he found references to weapons that had been built but never used. The display showed technical specifications that looked more like theoretical physics than practical engineering. Planet crackers that could split worlds in half. Stellar manipulators that could turn suns into weapons. Something called extinction protocols that could sterilize entire solar systems, Vextel listed, his 4 eyes reflecting the horror of what he was describing. The room fell completely silent except for the sound of nervous breathing. Ro's report concluded that we had been fighting humans who were not only holding back, but who had access to weapons that could end civilizations, the commander explained. Every battle we fought, every clever tactic we faced, every desperate defense they mounted, all of it was accomplished using what they considered basic, conventional equipment. The weight of this revelation pressed down on everyone present like a physical force. Lieutenant Jung Song was tasked with writing the final intelligence summary, Vextel said, his voice filled with remembered dread. Her report was only 3 pages long, but it contained one sentence that forced our high command to completely reconsider the entire war. He paused, letting the tension build in the room like pressure in a sealed container. Song wrote, "We have spent 1 year fighting the galaxy's most dangerous predators while they were actively trying to remain civilized and restrained," the commander concluded. She calculated that if humans had used even half of their true military potential, our entire fleet would have been destroyed in the first week of combat. The implications hung in the air like a toxic cloud, and every officer in the room understood that they had just learned something that would change how they viewed warfare forever. The sounds of battle alarms filled the lecture hall as red lights flashed throughout the military station. Young officers turned toward the viewports, seeing the massive shapes of warships moving into formation in the darkness of space outside. Vextal stood slowly, his scarred frame silhouetted against the flashing emergency lights. "Your timing is perfect, cadets," he said, his voice carrying a note of dark satisfaction. "Today you get to witness history being made." The holographic display changed to show real-time fleet movements, dozens of ships from different species, forming up in battle formation. But the most impressive vessels were clearly the human dreadnoughts, their sleek hulls bristling with weapons that the young officers now understood were far more dangerous than they appeared. "Admiral Ji-hoon Ko has been given command of the Joint Federation Fleet," Vextal announced, pointing toward the largest human ship visible through the viewport. "His target is the Void Syndicate, the same organization that voted against human membership in the Federation just 6 months ago." A young officer near the front looked confused. "Sir, weren't they our allies until recently?" Vextal's mandibles clicked with what might have been amusement. They were indeed. The Void Syndicate controlled 12 star systems and commanded one of the largest fleets in this sector. They opposed human admission to the Federation because they thought humans were too dangerous to be trusted with advanced technology. The irony was not lost on anyone in the room. The hologram showed Syndicate fleet positions, nearly 200 ships preparing to defend their territory against what they believed would be a standard Federation enforcement action. "The Syndicate made the same mistake we made," the commander continued, his voice growing more serious. "They looked at humanity's single star system, their relatively small fleet, and their lack of exotic weapons, and they assumed they were dealing with primitives. Through the viewport, human ships could be seen moving into position with the fluid grace that the young officers now recognized as something far more dangerous than it appeared. Each vessel moved with purpose, taking positions that would have seemed random to most military analysts, but were clearly part of a larger tactical pattern. Captain Daeun Shin developed the tactical framework that our entire fleet now uses," Vextal explained, gesturing toward the formation outside. "Instead of the rigid battle lines we use for centuries, Shin created flexible combat groups that can adapt instantly to changing battlefield conditions." The display showed how Federation ships were now arranged in the flowing, organic patterns that human commanders had pioneered during the Sol campaign. "Colonel Min Seok Nam's endurance protocols changed everything about how we supply our fleets," the commander continued. "Before the humans joined us, our ships could operate for maybe 2 months without resupply. Now, using Nam's techniques, our vessels can fight for over a year without returning to base." Several officers nodded, remembering their recent training, exercises that had lasted far longer than anything their predecessors had experienced. "And Major Gayong Lim's psychological warfare innovations," Vextal said, his voice dropping slightly. "Well, let's just say that most enemy fleets now surrender after receiving her carefully crafted surrender demands. They've learned that fighting humans and their allies is not a pleasant experience." The alarms gradually faded as the fleet finished forming up, leaving the room in an expectant quiet. Outside, nearly 300 Federation vessels hung in perfect formation, waiting for the order to depart. "You asked at the beginning of this lecture why humans were granted Federation membership so quickly," Vextal said, his 4 eyes scanning the faces of his audience one final time. "The answer should be obvious now. We learned that having humans as enemies nearly destroyed our civilization. Having them as allies might make us the most powerful force this galaxy has ever seen." Gestured toward the massive fleet, visible through the viewport. "The Void Syndicate is about to learn what we learned during the Sol campaign, that underestimating humanity is the last mistake most species ever make." The young officers began gathering their materials and preparing to leave, their minds still, processing everything they had heard over the past hour. "Class dismissed," Vextal announced. "But remember this lesson above all others. When you serve alongside human officers, you're not just working with allies. You're working with members of the only species that mastered the art of war and then chose to use that mastery to protect others rather than conquer them. As the cadets filed out of the lecture hall, their conversations buzzing with excitement and newfound respect, Vextal remained at the viewport. The human dreadnoughts were beginning to move, their engines creating brilliant points of light in the darkness. Soon, the Void Syndicate would discover what happened when humanity went to war not as desperate defenders of their homeworld, but as the strategic leaders of the galaxy's most powerful military alliance. Commander Vextal almost felt sorry for them. Almost. The end.